Good afternoon, everyone. Andy Compton from Blackfoot here. Thank you very much for joining us today. So we've got a really interesting 40 to 45 minute web presentation for you today on the internet and organised crime. And I think we should last about 45 minutes, depending on the amount of Q&A that we get towards the end. But I'm anticipating that there's going to be quite a bit of that because of the interest that we've had in this event today. So what are we going to be doing today? So the objective is really to share information with you. That's really our primary objective of all events that we do. The subject at the moment is internet crime, and it's a growing problem, and that's, it's very topical at the moment. That's why we've actually selected it. So there's many victims out there of organised crime and internet crime. Some of those are governments, some of those are businesses, and some of those are citizens. We think this is an important subject because some of the victims aren't able to protect themselves. Some businesses don't know how best to protect themselves. And there's also challenges with lawmakers across Europe who aren't perhaps quite lined up sufficiently yet to be able to make change and help reduce the problem. So what are we going to do today? We're going to look at where we are as in this issue. We're going to look at the 2014 Europol or Interpol report on organised crime, so that we can establish what's been happening over the last few years and what the risk is ahead of us. And we're also going to be talking a little bit about where responsibility sits. And what changes are already happening and coming over the horizon in the very near future. And I think we're going to wrap that up a little bit later, talking about how businesses can contribute by reducing their own risks. So those are the objectives today, is to sort of share information about you in that way. You know how long it's going to take. We will be taking the opportunity for your benefit to mute the microphones during the presentations, but we will be taking questions, and within the chat box, if you want to input questions as they arise during the event, then what we'll do is we'll capture those and come back to those at the Q&A section. So that's in the chat window that's in the GoToMeeting pane on your screen. And I think we'll then wrap up with a Q&A at the back end, and just introduce you, if you've been interested by the subject, we'll just introduce you briefly at the end to other events that we have coming up. So that's all from me for the time being. I'm going to pass you across to Matthew Tyler, Blackfoot CEO, who's going to talk you through the main thrust of today's presentation. So I'm going to mute myself now, and I hope you find it very interesting, and I'll be back to you towards the end. Thank you. Matthew.
Hello everyone, thanks for joining, thanks for sparing some of your very precious time. We're going to spend a bit of time today looking at the recent Europol report into organised crime. We're also going to look at security and changes in legislation and stuff like that. So I'm going to spend a couple of minutes, just for those of you who don't know us, introducing you to Blackfoot. We're then going to talk about how we got where we are. We're then going to talk about where we are and look and reference the Europol report quite heavily for that. We're then going to look at collective responsibility. As Andy said, some of the victims of this type of crime can't defend themselves and can't stand up for themselves, so therefore there's a onus on government, regulators and businesses to assist and adapt. So Blackfoot, so we've been going about 6 or 7 years. We're risk, security and compliance specialists. We're seen as thought leaders. We specialize in multi-regulated or complex issues surrounding businesses, and we are primarily focused on business risk. We've got around about 100 customers, most of which are household names, and we're growing at a rate of about 20% a year. So how have we got here? So if we start looking at the evolution, what's happened over the last 10 or 15 years. So we've picked PCI. I know that's not relevant to everybody here. However, this is a regulation which has been around for a good 10 years now. and as such has got quite a lot of background and change to it. So it gives a guide of where regulations are likely to go with other laws and security standards. So in 2003, we had the OWASP launch their top 10 vulnerabilities for web applications, including things like cross-site scripting and SQL injection. PCI version 1 comes out in 2004. Interesting enough, in 2006, EU visa liability shifts at point of sale for chip and pin devices. So that was only 8 years ago. And believe it or not, the first iPhone was only launched in 2006. So before 2006, you could get on the internet with a smartphone, but you needed a degree in computer science to actually get anything relevant from it. We also had a massive data breach in 2006, which at the time was the largest, and from TK Maxx. In 2007, Blackfoot were giving guidance on secret and lies, 5 myths of PCIs, things like there's no silver bullet. PCI 1.2 comes in 2008, Configure virus hits, and we're delivering presentations and advice and guidance on taking a risk-based approach to security. In 2009, the Security Standards Commission, the people who write the PCI standards, came out with their prioritized approach or risk-based approach. Heartland Payment Systems got breached in 2009, which beat TK Maxx and became the largest breach to date. And PCI third parties, we were very, very aware at the time and giving a huge amount of guidance on the risk involved with third-party access into corporate networks. 2010, PCI Standards Commission comes out with the 10 myths, which are a lot like the five lies and secrets. PCI version 2 comes out. Believe it or not, 4 years ago, iPads were released. So prior to that, again, tablets were around, but nobody really used them. And look at how that has changed our buying and habits, and also that the requirements for those who have consumer-based websites to make them more tablet ready. And in 2010, we had Lush breached as well, which in the UK was one of the larger ones. In 2011, Visa EU launched the Technology Innovation Programme. This was much more aligned to risk, and because the risk in the chip and pin face-to-face market had reduced, the requirements for compliance were reduced in line, which is a really nice, sensible, pragmatic approach. 2011, Sony got hacked, Lutzek came and went. We were delivering the future of payments, and we also created Cornucopia in conjunction with OWASP to assist in the creation of securely coded websites through a card game. 2012, 2013, Crimeware as a Service comes of age. The SSC endorse Cornucopia, and we're talking about privacy, and we issue warnings around Dexter and other things. Last year and this year, well, everyone seems to be hacked, and we formally launched Cornucopia. So where are we now? We're moving into the Europol report on, this is the recent one based in 2013-2012 research, Internet Organised Crime and Threat Assessment. So where are we today? 2.8 billion Internet users globally, 380 million Internet-enabled Europeans. It's grown over 400% over 10 years. And we reckon that global smartphone sales are going to reach 1.2 billion in 2014. How have things changed? Well, if I wanted to steal a gigabyte's worth of information in 1980, the cost of that gigabyte's worth of storage would have been up in around $3 million. Whereas today, as you can see, the advent of clouds at the cost of under 10 cents per gigabyte has enabled things like iCloud and so Apple and Microsoft and Google to be able to give you gigs worth of free cloud storage. It's also massively affected business decisions on creating IT systems. If you were creating one back in the 1980s, then you'd need to ensure that there was no data replication. However, now, with storage being so cheap, there really isn't an excuse for high availability, data replication, and ensuring that the information is always available to you. What else has changed in the last 20 years? This graph charts the growth of the world's population who've got an internet connection. And as you can see, in 95 it was down at 0.1%, and it's now approaching 40% of the world's population. This has facilitated vast changes in the way businesses can interact with customers. Gone are the days where you actually need shops to reach local customers in a local environment. You can now, with a website, reach 40% of the world's population, which is fantastic for e-commerce. However, from a threat perspective, I've now got almost half of the world's population who've got access to my corporate networks. Bandwidth, home use bandwidth and corporate bandwidth. A lot of people have heard of Moore's law, but this is Nielsen's law. So Moore's law suggests that computer power will grow by 60% or double every 18 months. Nielsen's law states that users' bandwidth is likely to grow by 50% a year, 10% less than Moore's law, the computer speed one. But having charted this from 1983, bear in mind this is a logarithmic scale, it actually comes out pretty close to 50%. And we've seen that. We've gone, I remember the days where you were on 28.8 K modems, and now we're up to 50 to 100 megabits per second at home broadband speeds. Now with this has facilitated the ability to upload video, download video, have much more content-rich content. And as bandwidth increases, the content increases in line. So if nothing actually loads faster, it's just more content-rich loading at the same time. And this shows no sign of abating either. So the Europol report also states that web application attacks, cyber espionage and POS intrusions accounted for 70% of all breaches. Financial sectors most heavily hit. They've been on an arms race for the last 10 or 15 years with cybercrime. Unfortunately, they seem to be on a bit of a losing battle. The worst thing about this is that as the arms race has escalated, the criminals have looked for the lowest hanging fruit, and that tends to be in sectors outside of finance who share financial information. So that tends to be the public sector, retail, accommodation and utilities. The report also states that corporate entities may be vulnerable via their third-party suppliers. As you heard, we were talking about this several years ago, and it's now come to effect with things like the Target breach being caused by the small third party who were monitoring fridge temperatures, who were given access to the same network as payments were on. Whether that was the right decision to make or not at the time, hindsight's probably said that it may not have been. They're saying that cybercrime is a growing problem. It seems to be self-managed with criminal hierarchies. The underground marketplaces can be accessed anonymously through things like the Onion Router or Tor. And once Silk Road was shut down, which is an example of how you can anonymously buy all sorts of nefarious things online, it took approximately an hour and a half for Silk Road 2 to be up and running. Recently, a global police presence has shut down about 24 of these sites, but my understanding is they're springing up faster than they can shut them down. The biggest change for these marketplaces is the ability for people to buy crimeware as a service or hacking as a service. This has meant that the required levels of skills to hack organizations has fallen through the floor, meaning that the amount of people who can do it is far greater. We've got a problem in the fact that this is cross-jurisdictional. So laws are set up and police forces were set up to deal with local criminals doing local crime physically. With the advent of cybercrime, we're worried about now getting hacked from Russians, from Chinese, from Eastern Europeans, from our own people, and the jurisdiction and global requirements for crime fighting just haven't caught up yet in a digital age. And it's costing economies around about the global economy around 300 billion a year. How easy is it to do? Well, here's an example. This is a denial of service attack tool called Low Orbit Iron Cannon. It's named after an end game weapon in an Xbox game for when harpoons, airstrikes and nukes fail. So the level of skill required to operate this is to stick either a URL or an IP address in, click lock on. The selected target will then come up as the web address you want, and then once you're happy with that, you hit I'm a charging my laser, and that fires off a denial of service attack. This was produced by Anonymous as part of the operation they carried out when Mr. Assange's site was no longer being able to accept payments from PayPal and Visa. A 19-year-old in the States downloaded this, probably not the brightest guy in the world, but ended up serving 18 months in jail for creating $100 million worth of damage through a denial of service attack. This, I don't know whether anybody caught this in the news last year. It wasn't widely talked about, but somebody proxied the entire world's internet traffic through Belarus and Iceland for a period of 48 hours. Nobody still really knows how it was done or where it was done, but as you can see, with the cost of storage being where it is currently, it doesn't really take a rocket scientist to work out the volume of information you could collate there and all of the interesting things you could find by reading through some of the emails and online banking registrations and shopping which was going on. Social engineering, still a massive problem. Human factor always has been, always will be. Spam, approximately 80 billion messages is a daily volume of spam, and about 76% of that spam isn't sent by people, it's sent by botnets. And unfortunately, victims of phishing is increasing across Europe as the sophistication of phishing and vishing attacks get ever increasingly stronger. Card payments. 2012, there were 40 billion card payments made in the single euro payments area, which is not as wide as the EU. 3.5 trillion euros transactions, and about 1.33 billion was acquired by fraud and criminals during that year. One of the interesting things we've seen a growth in is skimming. These tend to be manufactured in China. Interestingly enough, you can probably go and buy them from Alibaba. They tend to be assembled in Eastern European and deployed to organised crime abroad. Recently, we've seen this escalate up to wiretapping of ATMs, which is proving to be a fairly popular way of card skimming. Also, another interesting fact, e-commerce, only 7% of card transactions occur out of country. So that's an example would be somebody in France using a UK site, or somebody in Spain using a French site. However, when you look at the amount of fraud carried out, foreign card transactions out of country account for around 50% of all fraud. So there's obviously some fairly simple steps you can do there with regards checking the 7% of transactions, because the fraud rates on them are exponentially higher than they are in country. Criminal finances. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out if you allow anonymous payments via things like cryptocurrencies, and they're used anonymously on the dark sides of the internet, then they're going to be used for laundering the proceeds of crime. The report also highlights, and there's been a further report done by Semantic on this, online gaming and online gambling. They believe that the majority of the growth in the last 5 years, from 1.2 billion euros to 26 billion euros just in Europe alone, is probably facilitating quite a large amount of money laundering. As an industry, it's sort of been left alone and it's had loose regulation. It tends to go to offshore tax havens where the regulations are either good or opaque, but it's pretty obvious that that growth in gaming and gambling is a very, very good way of transferring and cashing out schemes. And obviously with virtual currencies offering complete anonymity and rapid transfer capabilities, this is forming a major facilitator of financially driven cybercrime as well. There are some even worse areas of the report involving things like child abuse, but I don't particularly want to dwell on that. If you want to dig those areas out in the report yourself, please feel free. But as you can see, some of the drives behind stealing information and ID theft aren't all around financial. They are also around some of the very darker areas of the internet and what that helps facilitate as well. So what were the conclusions from the Europol report? One of them was to try and limit anonymity on private networks like Tor. That's probably going to prove hard because it's the US Department of Defense who fund at all. Other things like taking down malicious sites and taking action against criminals is all well and good, but unfortunately, as we've seen with Silk Road, they can bring them up faster than we can take them down. Investigate actuals. You look at the criminal use of virtual currencies, better protect citizens' information, prevent the abuse of stolen credentials, which does lead to human trafficking, and as we saw in the previous slide, some fairly nefarious things. They had some recommendations for law enforcement as well. They were saying that we need to, one of the issues we have is we have different levels and different standards for digital forensics across the member states, and because most of this fraud or criminal activity is cross-state, then having an EU-wide standard would be a very good idea. They're also asking and suggesting that regulators look at hardware and software manufacturers and network operators and internet services, as they have a part to play in the transmission of this type of crime. And EU legislators should look jointly at balancing coherent legislation measures with protecting citizens and business, which is what they're doing currently. So we have a collective responsibility. So governments have a collective responsibility to protect their citizens and protect the businesses and interests and GDP of the country. To that effect, we've had things like GCHQ encouraging the FTSE 250 to have a look at cyber risk and do cyber reviews last November. We've got governments enforcing standards, and we've got governments making contractual changes, which we go into. We've got regulators hardening standards, making contractual or forcing contractual changes, making legal changes, and changing the stewardship and ownership. We've heard a lot recently about the changes in banking regulation, which will make senior bankers actually accountable for once. And businesses, with the increase in impact of issues surrounding data loss, this is moving out of an IT risk register problem and moving to a C-suite risk register problem. And that is causing, as we're seeing it, some fairly large changes in how businesses are looking to deal with this. So government. In the UK, we saw MI5 and GCHQ writing to the chairman of the FTSE 350 saying, conduct one. We believe you're under attack. We now know how they knew, because obviously GCHQ and MI5 have been assisting in the attacks, aka the Edward Snowden revelations. So this wasn't just from a, we think this might be happening. This was from a, we're actually doing this to you, and it's very, very easy. So the Department for Business Innovation and Skills, bless its cotton socks, or tinkering as I like to call it, has come out with their UK Cyber Kite Mark, which some of you may be aware of. This is a prerequisite for anybody who wants to supply to government. Now, because it's a prerequisite to supply to government, that's likely to then affect the supply chain of those who supply to government, and that is likely to become almost like a de facto standard for anybody in the B2B world, just so that they've got a general level of governance in the business. So again, this comes in 3 levels: bronze, silver, gold, and includes technical standard or self-assessment or external validation. So already there's about 40 or 50 or 100 customers who claim to have this type of certification in the market, and we're starting to see tenders come out of government, things like GCAP, with these as a prerequisite. Regulators. PCI DSS version 3 hits in January. There's been some very, very sensible changes in version 3. The main one revolves around the use of outsource partners or business process outsourcers. Whereas previously you would have got away with some fairly minor amounts of due diligence on outsource partners, version 3 is probably going to negate the majority of outsourced contracts. Things like you need a matrix of responsibility. So out of all of the 300 individual elements in the standard, as a service provider or an outsource partner to me, which of these are you responsible for? Which of these are you leaving me to be responsible for? And which of these have a joint shared responsibility? This, we're going to see problems from 2 points. One, service providers scrabbling around to try and get an understanding of what they actually want to be responsible for. And 2, clients requiring this for audits come January onwards. So there we see some fairly large contractuals. Some of the reasons this has been put in place, Well, third-party management has been, or lack of third-party management, or access hacks from third parties have been an ever-increasing route into corporate networks as they increase their own security and compliance and governance. Unfortunately, are only as strong as your weakest link. And if you're not managing external access into your network via third parties, that is going to be your weakest link. EU Internet Payments. The Payment Services Directive 2 comes in February 15. Love or hate the EU, they're trying to make some harmonisation and trying to protect and grow the take-up of online. So what does it cover? It covers pretty much, it's much wider than payment cards. It covers any type of online transactions, so direct debits, money transfers, online banking, wealth management platforms, a whole raft of things. There's 14 technical standards within the data security standard for this, very similarly along the lines of the sort of PCI or ISO sections. One of the sections is strong authentication of online users, and we are likely to see that cause some significant technical headaches for organizations as they look to implement ways in which they can increase authentication of users without increasing the amount of failed user attempts, increases to call centers, and adding friction to the user experience, which is usually in contradiction to what businesses want. UK payments, believe it or not, outside of banks, payment service providers have been regulated by the Consumer Credit Council up until now. The UK government and the EU see payments as part of the critical infrastructure now, and as such, the Bank of England has set up a new regulator, UK Payments Systems Regulator, which comes into effect in 2015. This is likely to have a number of effects. We are likely to see, as we have been with the recent purchase by WorldPay of YesPay and by Barclays of the Logic Group, consolidation in this marketplace. If all of a sudden you've got to go and put £1 million worth of operational governance expense in, then you're likely to either want to sell to somebody who's already got it in, or merge with other people to get economies of scale. So we're likely in the payment service provider market to see a decrease over the next couple of years in competition due to the increase in operational expense of having to implement proper governance. EU data protection regulation. Now, this hasn't quite been passed yet, so we haven't quite got a time on when this comes in fully. One of the things they're arguing about is the time for the 28 member states to implement. Should it be 6 months? Should it be 2 years? They're not arguing about any of the points in it, so the fines will be at 2% of global turnover, and that has a step change. When that comes in, I'm not 100% sure. We've got somewhere in the region of 2 years. However, some of it has crept in through the back door. So we've had things like the right to forget. You'll have seen in the papers over the last couple of months, Google's 1.5 trillion requests for people to get rid of the fact that somebody wasn't very nice to them on the web several years ago. The crazy thing is, if you just search via google.com rather than co.uk, you find them all anyway. So that is an interesting one, the right to be forgotten, and that is now law. Currently, it only applies to people like Google and monster organizations, but look, this is the start of a slippery slope, and it's likely to expand to all information held by anybody. So the consent for that is going to be moving forward at quite a rate. The other thing which has come in is explicit consent. So we've seen when the web started 10, 15 years ago, we'd just grab all the details going for anybody, and we'd be buying lists in from marketing companies, and we would just basically batter that list out as sort of spam. We then moved to taking registration information off people when they went to the site. We then had to put these silly boxes in about consent, but we could have them pre-ticked, which was implied consent. And then 2 years ago, the EU changed the law to say, no, you have to physically tick the consent box, which is called explicit consent. Now that sort of slid through the radar, and most people now have changed their websites to do that. But what really came home to roost a couple of months ago was a case in the small claims small claims tribunal in the UK, which was John Lewis Group versus Mr. Mansfield, who's a Sky TV producer. He decided that because John Lewis hadn't asked his explicit consent to send through what he deemed as spam, he took them to the small claims court. Now, in the UK, our judges don't tend to go along the American lines of punitive damages, which is, you know, how much money has God has and we double it. They tend to actually take a bit more of a sensible approach and look at actual harm and actual damage and actual loss. So what was fairly unique about this case is that the judge ruled that there was actual loss here, and the actual loss accounted to £1,500. So that doesn't sound like a huge issue until you realise that John Lewis Group send out about probably 10 or 20 emails, 20 million unique emails to Mr. Mansfield's or his equivalents. So if you multiply up £1,500 by 10 million, you get to an outrageously large amount, which sort of comes in, is now in, and sort of has hit a year or two before this regulation comes in. So if you receive a lot of spam as a consumer, I'd suggest you go and get a small claims court action against all the spammers. And if you're a company which sends out a lot of this stuff, I would suggest you go and have a look at your consent models currently, because your liability has gone from a £250,000 slap on the wrist from the ICO to a £1,500 per email you're sending. So businesses. So risk management. UK businesses want to and are reducing risk, and as the impact of this changes and increases, the risk increases, therefore the amount we can spend on it, mitigating it, should increase as well. We have the problem that we've got more than one standard coming in now. So if you were a retailer, all you really needed to bother about was PCI up until recently. If you were government, all you really needed to bother with, as I say. Now, if you want to sell to government, you're going to need PCI, you're going to need ISO, you're going to need cyber kite mark. Complying with multiple standards can't be done in a siloed approach. You've got to have a smarter, more joined up approach to this. You've really got to follow a risk-based approach and apply the appropriate levels of governance intelligently. Blanket approaches just don't work. The country's full of the bloodbath of dead ISO projects because they weren't done on a risk-based approach. They were trying to be done on a blanket approach. So pick a standard, any standard. How do they help me? So let's take a look at PCI. So out of all of the questions in PCI DSS, there is not one which helps you keep your £1 billion e-commerce website up and running. Why? Because the people writing the standard don't care if it's up and running, they only care if you lose their data, which is why the confidentiality is where all the questions sit. There are a few about integrity because they don't want you getting their data numbers wrong. If we look at the innovation skills cyber kite mark, we're looking at actually a fairly balanced approach. But if I'm worried about availability of my systems, that may, again, I may be overspending on integrity and confidentiality. If I'm only really worried about availability, maybe the critical infrastructure EU guidance will be better for me. Maybe, unfortunately, I need to comply with all of them, in which case you're going to end up finding that some of these have contradictory statements in them. So, reducing business risk. So we're looking at undertaking analysis of organizational structure. We're then looking at scoping of these assessments. We're then looking at threat scenarios. We're then looking at risk assessment remediations and the continuing review of pre-control risk. So what do we actually mean by that? So planning. So the first thing you need to do as a business is you need to go and agree your impact scales and your likelihood scales. Here's an example. You're going to find people agree with this, you're going to find people disagree with this. The numbers in there aren't that important. Initially, this is more of a baseline. However, getting this appetite right can significantly save you money. So identify what's of value to you. Is it critical systems? Is it market advantage? Is it P&L information? Is it M&A information? Is it customer information? Is it IP? Then work out what's of value to others. So you've done a risk assessment based on what's the risk to you. Have you done an impact assessment on what's the risk to the data subject? So this is easier said than done, and this is where some of the Blackfoot special sauce comes in. So how does confidentiality, integrity, and availability breaches affect each information asset? Well, there's only three ways in which they can do that. It's either financial loss, regulatory impact, or reputational damage. So to quantify reputational impact, regional regulations, and quantify financial loss is actually quite a tricky process and requires quite a lot of science sitting behind it. Once we've done that, though, you then have the metrics for measuring and comparing impact and likelihood. We understand which information assets we have. We understand what the impact of a compromise of CI or A will have on those individual assets. And we now know what the business is willing to accept in terms of risk and what it isn't willing to accept. So what is the likelihood of this risk materializing? Well, this year we need to looking at the threat actors and looking at threat analysis. So you've got basically three different things which can happen to stuff: malicious, inside, outside, or accidental. We can identify where the threats come from, identify the value of the asset, and map the threat to each asset. So here's an example. So for a managed service provider, as an example, competitors or nation states are likely to be after the information. And what sort of information they're likely to be after? Business IP and operational information. We've seen that the Chinese basically have been sucking all the information off any corporate laptop which goes anywhere near China for years and years and years. They're not so much involved in the intellectual property the businesses own. What they're interested in is the intellectual property surrounding the business operations and management. Very easy to make stuff for £1. It's very hard to sell iPhones for £700 and be worth 700 billion. The money isn't made in making the stuff, although making the stuff has some money attached to it. So once we've got an assessment of gross risk, we understand what our risk appetite is. I don't mind I don't mind my business losing anything under $500,000, but I really don't want it to lose anything over 5. We understand what information assets we have, and we understand the threats posed against those information assets. That gives us gross risk. So why is gross risk important? Well, gross risk is important because you can consider your security spend. If the risk of me losing a certain information asset or not having it available for a day or two is under my threshold, I don't need to focus on it. I can just focus on what's important. And with more detailed, granular information, I can facilitate the right types of insurance to transfer some of this risk as well, whilst I'm dealing with it. We can then start looking at a controls assessment. We see a lot of businesses who start off looking at controls assessments. They start off by looking at things like, how does my business compare against the SANS 20 or industry best practice, or how's my business aligned to ISO? It's the wrong question. These blanket approaches just won't work. How do I compare to SANS or industry best practice for the specific issues surrounding the information assets I care about? That then gives you the information you need. So then we can move into looking at, once we've looked at the impact gross risk, and we've decided and helped work out what the maturity of the controls should be post-risk, then we can get to a net risk position. Once we know our pre-control risk of the CIA compromises, we know the threats of our assets and the resources and their intent. We also know how effective our controls are against these threats. Have we met the maturity levels for these controls in the areas where we need them? Then we can move into remediation. So what are the options? If I found something above my risk appetite, I can do a number of things. I can accept the risk. I can play with my risk appetite. Maybe my initial risk appetite was set too low as an organization and everything's become an unacceptable risk. Maybe I can get some assistance in understanding what like-minded businesses have as their own risk thresholds, and I can monitor change to the metrics. So if, as an example, data protection laws come in and the fines go from a maximum of $250,000 to 2% of my business, and 2% of my revenue is 10 million, then I probably am going to want slightly higher maturity on the controls surrounding that information. If I'm managing this through pre-control risk, then I can affect those slides and dialers irrespective of what the controls I've got in the business. You can treat risk. We can update, we can remove controls, we can change them, we can increase the maturity of them, and you can insure stuff out. There's quite a few cyber policies out there. One of the things we do outside of information governance is we actually assist the insurers in the UK to underwrite cyber cover for the larger of their clients to get a better understanding of where they actually sit on the risk scale, so that they can get a better understanding of what the likely premiums and coverage should be for their clients. Then you can review. So with this approach, the benefits of following this type of approach ensures that risk is aligned to business strategy rather than to the amount of firewalls I have. I can ensure that it's aligned to business appetite. So I'm not spending on stuff which is below the business appetite, and I'm focusing and I'm showing and assisting the decision makers, the board, the money men, that we're spending appropriate levels in appropriate places. We can align it to business impact. We can establish a potential understanding of threat sources and keep that up to date and monitored. So hacktivism wasn't really around 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, and then with the advent of Anonymous, it's become a huge part and potential threat to businesses. Establish an understanding of the impact of individual threat scenarios. So again, rather than having a blanket approach to everything, there may well be a completely different outcome to a laptop left on a train by an employee, to Russian hackers taking all of your card data and personal information, or GOP stating that they've had physical network access to Sony Pictures and have taken basically everything they have. You can also get a clear definition of remedial activities aligned to that business impact, which is going to help you get budgets to do what you want, because you can explain why you want to do it. And you can ensure changes are anticipated, captured, and managed. Risk changes, threats change, vectors change, actors change and evolve. This needs to be an ongoing process. So with that in mind, I hope that's been enlightening, and I hope that's been helpful. And I'm just going to throw it back to Andy now to see if there's been any questions come in.
Lovely. Thanks, Matthew. So I'm still waiting for questions to come in, but if I can just backtrack really, just to summarize the different categories that we've covered off in there. So really what you've done is you've given us quite a useful introduction, thank you, into what's happening out there and what the problems are. You've introduced the collective responsibility need, I think, really, and of course we've then sort of delved into that a little bit and sort of said, so what's happening within government, what's happening within regulation, what's happening within lawmakers, and how is that likely to affect us over the coming years. So again, a really useful introduction. So the final part to that is what the businesses should be doing about that, and what their responsibility is in making sure that these risks reduce. And that's really about taking the risks back home to their business, or not taking the risks, but taking the message back to the business and making sure that businesses are reducing risk wherever possible. And then thank you, you've introduced a very useful risk reduction methodology through risk assessment. So that's really I think been a very helpful sort of stroll through that particular problem. In terms of Q&A, I'm still waiting for questions. I have a question though, Matthew, which is your opinion on whether boards are now starting to push more towards moving to the cloud. We know that companies want to embrace cloud. We know that they want to move their infrastructure to the cloud, and we also know at the same time that they are, marketing departments are encouraging this because they want to interact with their customers in an entirely new way. They want to make portals available to them. How do you see the move to the cloud? And do you think organizations moving to the cloud add to the problem, or do you think they actually ease the problem a little bit?
That's an interesting question, Andy. So cloud adoption is inevitable. Um, it's just an inevitability. So, and if you don't believe me, I would be highly surprised if the retailers who suffered on Black Friday in the UK last week, I won't mention names, but there was one who, when you went on their site, you were kindly told that you were 128,000th in the queue and you should be able to get on their site within 25 minutes. All of the companies mentioned in the news articles have got in-sourced websites. So the problem you have with not enabling some form of power or usage on demand, which is scalable, which you only pay for when you need, is that unfortunately retailer specifically has peaks. And with these peaks, you either need to provision for the peak, which is hugely costly, or you need to go and rent it whilst the peak's happening. So when those organisations take a review, which they almost certainly will, because I should imagine the boards won't be too happy that they had 128,000 customers who couldn't get on their website to buy something from them, who probably all then went off to Amazon and bought from them. When those reviews happen, and the costs of the options are costed out, and you've got option one, which is we can go and rent additional usage and processing power when we need it at a very small cost, or we can go and spend several £1,000,000 provisioning our own for the 2 days a year we need it. It's going to be a pretty hard decision for security and IT to make to stop that going to the cloud. So I'll say a couple of things about clouds. In most cases, from the businesses I see, it's probably a really good way of getting an understanding of where on earth your information is, because most businesses, 90% of their IT spent on maintaining legacy information. And actually, if you take certain information assets out of your business and put them into the cloud, one, you need to know where they are to get them moved, which is probably a good thing, because a lot of businesses we see haven't got a full understanding of where their information is. You're then chopping access to other things like small access databases, which are running off the back end, which nobody knows about, and you're putting those into the cloud. So what you'll find is actually a business whose sole job it is to look after your information may well, on brand new kit in the cloud, may well do it better than your current old legacy IT systems are doing it. And with the cost differential, it's an inevitability. But take a risk-based approach. So what information should I put in the cloud? Well, there's certain information we've seen earlier by taking a risk-based approach. It doesn't really matter if the business lose it. So that would be quite an easy one to put into a shared cloud. I've got certain information which I really don't want to use. So as long as I'm doing a risk assessment, a pre-control risk assessment, and understand the level of maturity of the security controls which need to surround that information asset, not a problem. I can outsource it to a cloud provider who can offer that level of maturity. It could be the level of maturity is very low. It could be the level of maturity is very high. But I don't see that as a reason to stop such businesses saving money by adopting clouds.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. One other question, in fact, I have two other questions, Matthew. One other question I'm particularly interested in is you asked a question, or sorry, raised a fact at the beginning about the number of mobile devices that will be in the world. I believe it's something at some point this year there'll be more mobile devices in the world than humans. I wondered what your thoughts were on bring your own device to work and how that may add to this problem.
Yeah, we're seeing this a lot. There's again, so we've got a fundamental problem of the fact that consumer technology now is as good as corporate technology. So spin back 5-10 years, the last place you go and surf online will be at home. You go into the corporate network because it's whizzy and fast. Unfortunately, due to Moore's law, what we've seen consumer technology now leapfrog corporate technology. The quick example of that's BlackBerry versus Android and iOS devices. BlackBerry owned that market. It was the only way corporates would use business devices. That's changed. So you've got a fundamental problem in the fact that businesses, when they buy something, want to sweat that asset through their finance departments, and that when consumers buy something, they want it to be the latest, fastest, quickest. So what you're going to see over the next several years is more and more questions from employees and senior management of, I want to use the stuff which I have, which works and is quick and is easy, rather than the stuff you give me, which is old, horrible, slow, and ugly. So we are moving towards a time whereby having just a flat no isn't going to help you. We've seen organisations adopt bring your own device or choose your own device, but look, we haven't even started yet. I know of loads of companies who have a BYOD policy. I don't know one where it includes wearable.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, forget dealing with BYOD on phones. What are you going to do with Google Glass, with the iWatch, with smart wearable tech? So, you know, again, there's some sort of inevitability here. So again, the question is, what is the risk that holds to my business? What information assets can they steal or not make available or destroy? How likely is it? And then what do I need to do about it?
Okay, so a sensible assessment, pragmatic assessment. Excellent. Thanks, Matt. So one final question's come in. I'll read it as it's presented. It says, Matt mentioned there isn't a silver bullet as such when it comes to security, but there is an overlap of requirements. Surely to minimize duplication of work, you'd want to create something that looks like a catch-all policy.
Yeah, so that's a very, very good point, and actually that leads to a slightly larger point, which is, to date, most organisations have had to deal with a single regulator or a single compliance standard or a single contractual obligation. We're seeing amongst service providers that move to multiple customer or contractual obligations, changes in regulation and changes in compliance standards as well. So I would actually probably go further and say I completely agree with the statement that taking a holistic approach with policies and procedures is a very clever thing to do. You don't want a specific policy surrounding how you deal with card data if losing personal information is more valuable to you. You want it a bit more homogenized. So that is a very sensible approach, but I'd actually go a step further and say stop siloing compliance programs. The amount of organizations we see who have got a PCI program going on, an ISO program going on, an FCA program going on, a kite mark program going on, and they're all siloed. And this leads to programs getting blown out of time and budget, programs falling by the wayside, and vast amounts of overspend, and more importantly, onerous policies and procedures in places in the business where they don't need them and shouldn't actually have to be applied there. So again, having a risk-based approach, even down to how you implement policies and procedures, is a really good idea. But as for the statement in the question, I could not agree more. Holistic approaches is far better to try and encompass everything, with some caveats, than it is to try and have 4 sets of policies and procedures which deal with different things.
Excellent. Thank you. Matt, we're heading up against, well, in fact, overtime now. So I have one further question which we'll respond to offline. If I could ask you just to, in fact, you've already done it, thank you, just to move us on the slide there. So if you've enjoyed today's event, if you think that it's been information and you've benefited from that, we've got some more events coming up in the near future. We're quite active at the moment in terms of sharing and communicating. We see it as a part of our responsibility. 19th of January is our next webinar on data privacy. You can find out about that on our website if you'd like to register. And then on the 9th of February, we're running a security in the cloud, a shared responsibility webinar. And that's really going to be of interest to service providers, but also hosts, also people that are actually hosted within service provider environments, because it sort of talks about the joint responsibility of hosting rather than just outsourcing and passing responsibility across, but it also introduces the method that the more that you put across there, perhaps, and more you centralize, the easier it is to actually ensure security in a better way. So very interesting pieces that we've got going on there. And then we're running the Blackfoot quarterly newsletter event that will release on March. This is a quarterly periodical for us, and you'll be able to see that in the near future. So again, that's available from the website. That produces for us a lot of interesting reading. Actually, it's more interesting reading for our customers than for us. We create it periodically. Relevant industry news. I think if I can just pick out a couple of items that we've discussed in the last, the very latest revision. What makes a good pen test? Always a compelling question. And we introduced a piece about weaponization. So what's happening with weaponization at the moment? Well, it's, weapons, hacking weapons are becoming very cheap, very commoditized, almost my Fisher Price, my first hacking tools. There's a lot of that happening now with these hacking tools happening at about, being available in mass at about the sort of $99 rate. So these types of articles are always a feature and a prominent feature of the Blackfoot newsletter. So if you'd like to receive that in the future from us, please fly by the website, or please drop us a line, and we'll share the contact information and how to get on those mailing lists with you. So finally, I think that just leaves me to thank you for sharing your lunchtime with us today. I hope it was of use to you. If you'd like to get in contact and ask us any further questions, including the one question that we haven't managed to get to, and we'll pick up offline, those are the contact details. And we very much hope to see you at a future event. So thank you very much for joining us.